Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
Too often, atheism and secularism are seen as simply destructive. Atheism is seen as the subtraction of something, namely religion, taking it from the world, leaving a void in society. In Leigh Eric Schmidt's new book, The Church of St. Thomas Paine, A Religious History of Secularism, we see how atheists and other freethinkers sought to build on the old religious traditions as much as to tear them down. Leigh Schmidt is a historian of American religion and the Edward C. Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professor in the Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis. Leigh, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thanks. It's great to be part of the conversation with you both.
Thanks, Leigh, for coming on. Definitely looking forward to talking about your book. Just to begin, maybe you can tell us how you got into studying the history of atheism and secularism, and maybe what is your own religious background?
Sure. Let's see. Well, I guess I worked into free thought and atheism and secularism via religious liberalism. So one of my projects, 15, 18 years ago, was on those religious folks who became seekers, Christians, Jews, who no longer were firmly rooted in the tradition in which they were raised, and they moved on to other things or explored other options or became a combination of things. And so those religious liberals were a lead-in to their free-thinking secular cousins, because many of the freethinkers and secularists were also alienated from their Christian or Jewish backgrounds, ended up sometimes through seeking themselves, ended up in a more forthrightly secularist posture. So I guess I moved into atheism and secularism as an area of study from that vantage point. And I guess the transition figure is I did a biography of a free-thinking spiritualist named Ida Craddock, who really had one foot in both realms. I mean, that is, she was a religious seeker, someone who grew up in a Protestant background, who ended up founding something she called a kind of church of yoga around 1900 in Chicago. But at the same time, she was very active in the National Liberal League and the American Secular Union. And so she was a natural bridge over into studying the secularists and the atheists as well, I think. As far as my own religious background goes, I grew up a liberal Protestant, and so I come from that background.
So give us a little more insight. I think you've given us a taste of what this subtitle alludes to, A Religious History of American Secularism. Is this from a religious perspective, you mean it? Or are you saying that that American secularism is the product of religion or religious thinking? Or neither?
Yeah, I am thinking of it more that there are aspects of secularism that are cast in religious terms. I mean, sure, there are certain affinities between Protestantism and secularism. There are certain ways these things line up, and you could kind of see Protestant dimensions to secularism. But those affinities aren't really what interest me. I think there are just too many places where there are sharp differences between free-thinking secularists and Protestants. So I don't concentrate on those. I'm more interested in the way in which certain groups of freethinkers and secularists see their projects in religious terms, that they imagine a religion after the loss of Christianity or after the loss of religion that they see in humanistic terms. So they have various ways of thinking about that, various ways of embodying it. They have a lot of labels for it: a religion of humanity, a religion of secularism. So it's the ways in which some secularists, certainly not all, some are adamantly opposed to this, see their project in religious ways. their humanism in religious terms as something of a surrogate for religion, but more than that, really a religion that supersedes the religions that have gone before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just building on that, like what did 19th century freethinkers, like what did they mean by religion? I
Yeah.
mean, I think probably today, maybe if you asked most people, they would say one aspect of religion is believing in God or gods. But obviously that wasn't true for most freethinkers. So what did they mean by when they talked about religion?
Right. There is a large debate about how to define religion. Part of it is just the fact that some secularists and freethinkers were claiming to have religion opens up a much bigger debate about what religion is.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
there's a default Protestant perspective in the United States, the end of the 20th century, that when you're talking about religion, you're talking about a belief in God. It's very, it's a kind of default position in which belief in God is taken to be constitutive of what religion is. And that's clearly not what these humanistic freethinkers had in mind. So they had more of a sense of religion as an ethical system. I mean, I think Felix Adler and the Society of Ethical Culture, I think the ethical culturists, they call ethical culture religion as well. I mean, they saw it in religious terms, but they also use this phrase ethical culture. And I think a lot of times that's what free thinkers who claim to have a religion of humanity were talking about. They were really thinking about this in ethical terms, moral terms. That would be the focus of it. I mean, there is something very, I mean, there's something very vague often about their evocation of a religion of humanity. You
Mm-hmm.
can't
Mm-hmm.
quite pin them down what they're talking about.
Right.
But other
Yeah.
points, I think, you get pretty clear what they're talking about. They're talking about what communities do together in terms of these life cycle rituals and things like that. So there's something more specific, or they're talking about getting together on Sundays and singing certain secular hymns or hearing certain humanistic meditations and things like that. So there's a vagueness to it, to their ideas about what a religion of humanity is, but there's also, in turn, sometimes something quite concrete about it, something much more, expressly collective and ritualistic.
Mm. So if I'm trying to go in two directions at once. I want to know more about what they were than what it was that they were rejecting. Perhaps that would be the other way to go. So if they're thinking of like, okay, well, we're still a religion. We're a religion of humanity, and we want to have not just a community of man, but like a fellowship. You want to actually have those people in a space and go through these rituals and these performances. What was it that they were rejecting? I guess would be
Right.
the flip side of the coin there. What did they want to get rid
Sure.
of?
I mean, a lot of it is very much about rejection, right? So I talk a lot about free thinkers and who want to develop secular funerals. And what is a secular funeral? Well, a secular funeral, in many ways, is known by what it is not. Right? You don't read the Bible at a secular funeral. You don't have a minister at a secular funeral. You don't have a recognizable Christian liturgy. You don't have a prayer. you know, and anytime some little element of Christianity gets smuggled in at a secular funeral, free thinkers feel like the whole thing's been ruined, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and because some pious relative sneaks a prayer in or gets a
Right.
minister to
Yes.
come in at the last moment and say something, and so the whole thing's been ruined. So yeah, a lot of it is about what you're rejecting, about what you're not doing, and what can't be there. And now on the other side of that, I mean, they are trying to create some recognizable forms, positively speaking, for what a secular funeral looks like. They do have handbooks, and here's appropriate words. Here are things we say, and things like that. So
Yeah. You still
they are
have to
trying to.
bury someone.
Pardon me.
You still have to bury someone at the end of it.
Yeah, no, that's right. So they still have they have gestures, they have certain sense of who the appropriate officiant is and things like that. So yeah, so that kind of creation of appropriate secular ceremonies is an important part of it. But I think they do begin with what they reject. all of the clerical dimensions of a funeral they want to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was struck by reading your book is just how important it was. I mean, like free thinkers took such care, I mean, before their deaths to try and ensure that they had a secular funeral, and that I mean, their deaths weren't there. There was no sort of reports of deathbed conversions or anything like that. Maybe you can just say more about why this was such an important issue to free thinkers.
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, I came to see that as really a defining feature, at a kind of everyday level or a dirt and dust level. I mean, worried about funerals. They talk about having secular marriages and things like that, or other kinds of secular rituals, but comparably speaking, I mean, there's very little record of those. Occasionally, in these positive circles, and in those few communities that are following Auguste Comte, there are some other rituals certainly that are developed, but in the bulk of free thinking circles, it really does come back to funerals. And I mean, I think they have a sense that their courageous stance in the world to be an unbeliever in the midst of a dominantly Christian society, that was going to be undone by pious relatives, and they really did try. I mean, often without success, though, to make sure this was going to go right, to make sure that they would write up their own eulogy, or they would specify what a service was going to look like. And in a number of instances, some relatives just thought that was not the way to go about a funeral, so they ditch those plans. But I really do think they had a sense that infidels, free thinkers, were caricatured, with these kind of deathbed conversion stories. And there were all kinds of ways in which they were going to be brought into a kind of Christian narrative at the end. So they put a lot of time into thinking about how they could avoid that. Yeah, I mean, it's highly charged, because of all of the stuff about deathbed conversion stories. Those circulate widely in Christian circles. Deathbed, recantations, and calling in the minister at the end, last words that are pious, those kinds of things. And so I think that secularists, when they really begin to try to create this open space for themselves, concentrate on funerals and what those funerals should look like.
Mm. So let's go back to the beginning of both the country and I guess the free thought movement, or the roots of the free thought movement, to Thomas Paine. Can you give us some background to us in the audience, to why Thomas Paine is so important?
Sure. Yeah, it's surprising how important I think Thomas Paine becomes in a singular kind of way. I mean, there's certainly a lot of deists, a good number of deists at the end of the 18th century, and others they could have lifted up. But Paine's story becomes central for a few reasons. He's a sterling American patriot. There's just no way to get around the fact that he contributed to an initial definition of America's revolutionary cause, and that he was a crucial patriot in that. So there's a sense that he needs to be remembered for that. But then when he goes on to write The Age of Reason in the mid-1790s, that is this forceful critique of the Bible and Christianity and miracles and revelation and prophecy, and he becomes persona non grata in the New Republic, especially among evangelical Christians. And so his reputation is impugned time and time again. And so for free thinkers who embrace his critique of Christianity and see him as a noble patriot, they can't believe he's being treated this way by this ungrateful nation. And so they see it as a matter of duty to kind of reclaim him and spare him from this stream of insults and character assassination. So it becomes a cause. I mean, a real cause to reclaim him. And so they begin, one way of doing it is they start celebrating his birthday, January 29th, as this festive day for deists and free thinkers. That begins in 1825 and becomes an annual tradition.
So Leigh,
Yeah.
hold on a second there. So deists, give us the background on what's meant by a deist.
Sure. So this
Because
is
I think it was common then, but
right. It's not so common now.
No.
So, and a lot of times Paine is, by his critics, is just called an atheist. And the finer point would be to say he's a deist. That is, he believes in a kind of watchmaker God, a God who has set the creation in motion, a kind of mathematical God, and believes in God as a kind of almighty lecturer on natural philosophy, basically. So there is a God. It's just not a Christian God. It's not a personal God, and it's a God who doesn't speak, words as revelation. The revelation comes in the form of the laws of nature, not in spoken words. So spoken words would be just an unreliable way for God to communicate about the creation.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the sense of the Bible's out, as a source of revelation. So deists, if they did look to the Bible, they would look to the Bible and see Jesus as a good moral teacher. And Paine would say something like that. There are many things here that make Jesus out to be a good moral teacher. It's just there's a lot of other things about the scripture that are completely fanciful and nonsensical in Paine's view. So it's that kind of critique. So the deist is someone who will often preserve a sense of Jesus as a moral teacher, preserve a sense of God as a kind of watchmaker, or the God who has set the creation in motion but is retired from it, and will sometimes still believe in rewards and punishments as at least as a kind of matter of social utility, that there needs to be some kind of sense of cosmic rewards and punishments. But Paine has no use for the churches. It isn't like he even sees the churches as particularly socially useful. Some deists would still see the churches as socially useful. There's an element in Jefferson of that, but not so much Paine, who just declares that he's not a member of any of the churches. And my own mind is my own church. And so it's all of these views about religion that mark Paine out as a danger in the American Protestant imagination, and the scorn heaped upon him is, extensive. So I think free thinkers,
to the point,
early
he's
free
kind
thinkers,
of written out of the founding fathers, isn't he?
right? That is something they start to see early on, right? That Paine is not getting his due, that he is written out, and that becomes clearer and clearer to them, so that they really rally around this notion that we're going to get Paine back into the core group. We're going to build, a monument to him, or statuary, and this is going to be a way in which we can get him honored. It's one of the main projects for this organized group of secularists who come on the scene in the United States in the 1870s, the National Liberal League. One of their big projects is they want to get this bust of Thomas Paine on display in Independence Hall. They fail to do that because there's just considerable Christian opposition to having Paine, this blasphemous infidel, put on par with other more reputable founders. So they lose that, but to them, this becomes a crucial cause, and one they're willing to keep playing. And in fact, now still, the Freedom from Religion Foundation and some of the other secular groups would love to see a Paine statue erected in Washington, D.C., and Paine finally recognized and honored. It's one of the lost causes of American secularism, really, to keep coming back to the notion that you're going to get Thomas Paine honored in the right way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do because Paine is essentially a trigger
Yeah.
for the religious right. So it's just very hard, to get enough politicians to say, yeah, I want to cite on to the Paine monument, because there are Paine supporters out there in the world, but there are just enough people who are still it's easy to raise the specter of Paine as an infidel, or to tap into that sense of him as godless in some kind of way, and not the kind of founding father that should be lifted up. So yeah, so this is just a long running cause, starting in an organized way in the 1820s and continuing really till today. There have been efforts to save Paine from his detractors, and it's a big part of the project. That can be a political project. I often see it as taking on religious significance in these settings, since a lot of the critique of Paine focuses on his religion. One of the things those who want to save Paine do is emphasize the benevolence of his religion, that his deism, his moral philosophy are better than Christianity. So they come in and to defend Paine, they put an emphasis on his religion as a way of, sure, you can always emphasize, hey, he's a patriot of the revolution, but more than that, they want to defend him on religious grounds against his detractors too. So it takes on a religious,
especially in the
significance.
sense that he sort of becomes a relic himself at one point, doesn't he? Could you tell us about
Right,
like his bones and
right.
where that piece of his brain came from?
Yeah, this is a case study for me. I mean, I became very interested in the complex notion of secular relics. And Paine's body, he's buried in New Rochelle, New York in 1809. And then a decade later, this British admirer, William Cobbett, and a co-conspirator rob the grave and take the remains back to England. So at that point, what American freethinkers are left with, or deists are left with, admirers or Paine are left with, is this empty tomb in New Rochelle. And they become, over time, pretty dedicated to the notion that it would be a good idea to reclaim those bones. And the bones are always just sort of one step out of their reach. Like there'll be a story that, you know, this freethinker has them, or that freethinker knows where they are, and they never can quite get them, right? But they're always on the chase. And then this American freethinker who's living in London, Moncure Conway, becomes the intermediary for this, and he's the one who eventually tracks down a number of Paine relics, including this supposed fragment of his brain, locks of his hair that then eventually get returned to the United States. Yeah, there's a lot of religious language used around his relics, and it's an opportunity to think about the intricacies of religious materiality among those who have really defined their identity by disclaiming religious materiality, because the secularist polemic against relics is, if anything, more thoroughgoing than the Protestant polemic against relics. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
so it's so it becomes especially fascinating to see how they negotiate that space. I mean, I just found odd. It seemed to me peculiar episode after peculiar episode involving Paine's remains and the search for Paine's remains. And one of the leading American secularists of the period is T.B. Wakeman, prominent, in all the secular organizations of the era. And he's a complete devotee to Thomas Paine and Paine's memory. And at one point, he's talking to the Manhattan Liberal League, which is the secular organization in New York City. And, on Paine's birthday, and he explains that he has a portrait of Paine in his parlor, and that he's decorated the portrait with the wings of a bird to make Paine out to be an angel. And then he gives a meditation about what it would mean if we thought about Paine as an angel. And, it's this, complicated moment in which Paine is literally fetishized by a leading American freethinker. And, of course, they have a very consistent polemic against fetishists too. So it's fascinating to see that. And many freethinkers in the room are quick, in reports on the occasion, to make it clear that, of course, we can't take Wakeman too seriously. He's a poet. He's just playing around with language. There were no angels. We don't believe in angels. This is, they squirm over the religious gesture that Wakeman has made and is reporting on.
But are they at the same time trying to sort of reproduce what, like, the effect from a religion?
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, right? I mean, there is, right, those who would do that. I mean, there are definitely secularists who want to reproduce the effect of religion within humanistic circles. So I think Wakeman comes close to that. The ones who are in these positive circles, the people who are connected to the French philosopher Auguste Comte, are especially prone to that, where in their religious meetings, they'll decide to recreate an altar that is heavily Catholic in appearance
Yeah.
and in the liturgical props they're willing to use in order to sanctify secularism, to give it an aura of sacrality, and they want to give it that aura. They're very, very much want to give it. So one of them puts up a relic, an associative relic from Comte himself on the altar in their Church of Humanity. They're not playing, he's not playing around. I mean, he's playing around, but he's serious. He's serious. He wants to create an aura for secularism that is expressly religious.
Mm. It has all the trappings. It's just divorced from God.
Right. There's a substitute for God, a kind of deification of humanity or something, right?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, still focusing on Paine. I mean, like his influence is obviously, I mean, for free thinkers from the sort of religious angle, but it's also political. Like his influence is also political in terms of his sort of anti monarchy and sort of support for republicanism and democracy. And I guess, I mean, one thing we've sort of been talking about on the podcast is this kind of connection between atheism and free thought, and then also like political radicalism. And I wonder if you think there is like a necessary connection there between sort of religious and political radicalism.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. How inherent it is, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a complex terrain. Definitely, there are really clear links between some of these admirers of Paine and political radicalism in terms of class issues, women's rights, and things like that. So there's definitely a link. I mean, I would, yeah, I'd like to go through a group like one of the main groups, this Thomas Paine National Historical Association or the Manhattan Liberal League, and just go through the membership list and try to figure out the politics in an across the board way. My sense is it's very hard to predict in a consistent way the politics that flow from the metaphysical denial, say, of God or the scriptures or these denials, right? So, I mean, I think that they can flow in different directions. That said, I mean, the Manhattan Liberal League is filled with a bunch of radicals on a number of points. I mean, especially free speech issues and things like that. So there's they're pretty strong linkages. It's just I think, as Nathan knows from his work, the politics end up being so exceedingly complex on a lot of issues, like with the race questions, for example. The free thinkers, you can see the progressive allegiances on one side, and you can see white supremacist implications, and on the other side. So it's I find the politics hard to generalize about, but I will say that if you were looking for a more consistent politics, probably in these Painite circles, you might be able to find it, just because there is so much admiration for his revolutionary politics, and a lot of what they're arguing about are, for Paine, why it should be reclaimed, are things about Paine's opposition to slavery, for example, or Paine is Paine's republicanism, or they're trying to reclaim his religion, but they are committed to his politics. Now, other times it seems to me that they just have a overly general sense of his patriotism, and so I can't really tell what the specific political content is, other than they think that he's a great symbol of the revolution or something, but I don't know what they're drawing from that.
Yeah. I know several years ago now, it was Common Sense was a favorite book of Fox News. So it changes year to year, apparently.
Right. I mean, I've seen these things go in strange ways.
Yeah.
see notices like, because I track these small groups, and sometimes you'll just find when, like this person loves Thomas Paine, but is also just really conservative on certain issues, and you just can't quite figure out like how did that happen,
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that seems to be that comes up again and again about Paine, he seems to be at least, if not sort of reduced to, but or perhaps concentrated in, he sort of becomes the mantra, "The world is my country, to do good my religion." How much of that is what inspires the humanists going forward? Can you give us a sense of like what that meant to them and how it was sort of conveyed into action, or became sort of a motivation?
yeah, I concentrate a lot on that motto that the world is my country, to do good is my religion, because even though that's not an exact Paine quote, that's the thing that sort of surprises you, is like it's actually a bit of a reworking of a phrase, and then it just becomes, it goes everywhere as if that is literally Paine's motto, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Like somewhere he announced it.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a
Right.
bit like "Play It Again, Sam" in Casablanca. It's not really there, but it's
Yeah,
it's sort of what we know the movie
so
as.
yeah, I mean, so it's one of those, right, where you're trying to trace it out and trying to figure out when it became the one line that they're so sure is the quintessence of Paine. But which I would say is, the 1830s and 1840s. That's when it gets lifted up, and then it ends up kind of the banner quote right through into the 20th century. But and sometimes I almost saw it as a confession of faith. Like it became creedal. Like this is what you say when you express your devotion to Thomas Paine. You reiterate that motto, and you don't really tell us what it means to you. Like you don't reflect on what are the implications of the cosmopolitanism of the first line. The world is my country. I didn't see much meditation on that flowed from that. To do good is my religion. A little more meditation on that. This sort of philanthropic imperative that becomes the way they understand their own religiosity. Yeah, but I found it almost like a creedal statement. Like this is what we affirm as free thinkers invested in Paine's memory. We know that investment can be condensed to this line, and we will say it, and then we'll say it again, and we'll put it on a banner, and we'll put it up on the wall of our fellowship hall. But we are not going to explicate the phrase. I mean, it was surprising to me. I wanted an explanation of the cosmopolitanism. I wanted to know what that meant to free thinkers. But I had that more of a sense that that's the way you defined your allegiance to Paine. It was a shorthand for your devotion to Paine and his memory. I mean, so that if you wanted to unpack it, what you'd have to do is like go back to all of the different speeches and see, because every year on Paine's birthday, sometimes at other times in the year, but especially then, there would be long orations about memorializing Paine. And, just to see if they unpacked that theme, the cosmopolitan theme or the philanthropic theme a bit more. Sometimes they did, but even Ingersoll, when he talked about that phrase, he basically treated it like it was something that you should inscribe, or it was kind of this bejeweled saying, and it really wasn't expanded upon why that phrase meant so much to free thinkers. It had become a badge. Free thinkers in the late 19th century had this little badge they wore, this Torch of Reason badge. I felt like that Paine thing was like a badge you put on.
Yeah. Because it doesn't necessarily motivate any internationalist or anti-nationalist sentiment. It never
I
gets.
would like to have thought it did. And that's one of the questions I would like to think more about, actually. I mean, it was one of the ones I had the kind of leftover at the end. You usually have questions left over at the end of
Yeah,
projects.
yeah.
And that was one of them that I had left over. The tension between their cosmopolitanism and a certain enlightened imperialism, and whether their cosmopolitanism, created a more explicitly anti-imperial allegiances, alliances. That was something that I wanted to figure out a little bit more. But
Yeah. I
and
mean, it makes me wonder, like, how it's strange that you celebrate him as a great American patriot and a great internationalist.
right,
So,
exactly. That's a tension too, I think, because they're saving him as an American patriot and very rarely thinking about his. They're asserting his global significance, but they're not really thinking that through.
I mean, maybe they would say like the principles of the American Revolution are kind of universal, and not sort of bound to the American context in particular. But I mean, yeah, but I mean, obviously, and like Paine is involved too with the French Revolution later on, and I think he's a deputy in the whatever one of like the National Assembly or whatever it is briefly. Anyway, I mean, I think we should move on to because there's yeah, there's a whole bunch more in your book, Lee, aside from just about Paine's legacy. You talk about a lot of people later on in the 19th century, free thinkers sort of experimenting with secular churches, like starting their own secular churches. And it seemed they usually, for the most part, they seemed like they died out fairly quickly after a couple of years. And but people kept trying. But maybe you can talk about like why were some successful, or why were some more successful than others, do you think, of these experiments?
Right. Yeah, there were a good number of experiments. I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to show was just even if they weren't long lived in many instances, and even if they didn't have a bumper crop of converts, um, nonetheless, there were a lot of experiments along these lines to have humanistic fellowships or atheist churches. And I just wanted to give some sense of the number of those experiments. So, yeah, I mean, I guess probably the one that is the most enduring from the 19th century. Well, there would be two ways to think about it, I guess, of the most enduring. One would be the Society of Ethical Culture. Those those groups, there are a handful of them by the end of the 19th century. Prominent one in London, but a number in the United States, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and then a few more come up in the 20th century. Those are prominent and long-lived congregations, fellowships, and I mean they have a strong leader in Felix Adler initially, and he attracts a strong group of lieutenants. I mean, people who have most of them have theological school educations, but are applying themselves their sense of ministry to these ethical societies, and so it's an accomplished group of leaders, and Adler himself is a good institution builder, and he lives a long life, and was able to tend to the institutions for a while. So that one's very successful. The other way to think about the successful ones would be to think that many of these Unitarian churches by the end of the 19th century are post-Christian and becoming more and more humanistic. And by the early decades of the 20th century, that's made explicit that there are these humanistic Unitarian churches led by humanistic Unitarian ministers. And those congregations are substantial, they last, they still around. There, so that those two are strong institutional expressions. The ones that don't last tend to be led by eccentric individuals without many resources behind them. So, like a farmer in Great Bend, Kansas, who starts an atheistic church of humanity about 1905. Well, he doesn't have a lot of resources, and he's not exactly in an area where he's got a lot of fellow atheists. So he's trying to recruit people. He recruits some people. He publishes evangelistic tracts for the Church of Humanity and for atheism for 20 some years, but it's not the beginning of an atheistic denomination in the way in which he hopes. He buys a hotel. He thinks he's going to have an atheistic school and everything for this Church of Humanity denomination, and that doesn't work out. And I guess another example would be Katie Kame Smith in Oregon, who starts is an advocate for what she calls secular churches and starts first secular church in Portland, Oregon. Now, why does that not work? probably any number of reasons, but certainly a major reason is that she dies quite young and is really only superintending these congregations for a few years. It's fairly successful while she's in charge, and there's just no collaborator who can take over once she dies. So those Oregon churches fade. But there are a couple of others, where individuals seem, again, probably the ones that are more successful, the ones that come from a denominational background and become free thinkers after being something else. Like this Presbyterian named M.M. Mangasarian, he starts something he calls the Independent Religious Society Rationalist in Chicago, and is pretty successful over a 20-some year period. I mean, he has a couple thousand people involved in that over a good number of years, and so there are successes here in creating humanistic churches, fellowships, and then one of the things that interests me all along is there's a big debate about what to call them. I mean, just my equivocation tells you there's a lot of equivocation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like, is this a fellowship? Is this a church? Why would we call it a church? Why wouldn't we call it a church?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So that itself, intrigues me. Like, just trying to figure out, watching atheists and humanists and agnostics and freethinkers debate what to call their groups when they organize and meet on Sunday mornings is a lively concern.
Well, it does, yeah. And that does kind of have a legal follow-up to it now, because one of the things that we follow these days is how the sort of this idea of the wall of separation between church and state, that's sort of come down. And what we're seeing a lot of now are rulings where there are these cutouts or carve-outs that allow religious rights to discriminate. So where people or groups that have religious beliefs, they're able to avoid a responsibility or impose something on the practices of others. And what I found interesting in your book was that you write that in the 20th century, these sort of, are they religions or not? They sort of, through a footnote in a court ruling, humanists and ethical societies and other groups gain recognition as religions. Could you explain what that ruling was and how it affected these humanist and ethical societies?
One of the things that happens in the 1950s is there are a couple of cases, one coming out of Oakland, California, and the other out of Washington, D.C., which are tax exemption cases for humanist fellowships. The one in Oakland is a humanist fellowship. It's called the Fellowship of Humanity or the Church of Humanity. And the one in Washington, D.C. is an ethical culture society. And in both localities, their tax exemption is challenged because they're seen as not meeting the standard of what is a religion. That is, they're not paying homage to a god on Sunday morning, and so why are we giving them a tax exemption? They don't deserve a religious exemption. So those go to court. They win those cases, so that there's a way in which that ethical culture society and the humanistic church both are seen as counting as a religion in that way. The turn on this is that once you get recognized as a religion, and those cases, that Fellowship of Humanity case and the Washington Ethical Society case gets written into a footnote in the Torquesa decision in 1961, which is where an atheist notary public wins his case at the Supreme Court, and he's able to actually become a notary public in Maryland without attesting to a belief in God. Roy Torquesa is a humanist, atheist, but anyway, he doesn't want to take this religious oath. He wins his case. In a footnote to that decision, these two other cases, these tax exemption cases, are mentioned, and in such a way as to say that humanism is a religion and ethical culture is a religion. That's good news in a way, because if you're a conscientious objector who's an ethical humanist, you now have some leverage to say that your ethical humanism should count in religious terms for claiming conscientious objection. So that does help in conscientious objection cases. The problem arises down the road when the religious right begins to mobilize themselves against secular humanism as this bugbear, they look at that and say, see, even the Supreme Court realizes that secular humanism is a religion. And therefore, this other religion is now the religion that's being established in our public schools at the expense of these old Christian mores where you had prayer in the public schools or devotional Bible reading in the public schools. So that becomes a huge battleground. Like, if secular humanism is a religion, if humanism itself is a religion, the argument goes that the state has started to favor it over Christianity, and therefore, Christians have a right to argue for the disestablishment of that religion. And so, the battle ensues. And one of the results is that a lot of secularists start dissociating themselves from religious humanism of that kind of Unitarian variety, or, that early 20th century religious humanism that, was behind that group in Oakland. It was behind the Washington Ethical Society, and just saying, no, secular humanism is not a religion. It has nothing to do with religion. It's a secular worldview based on rationalism and science, and become quite insistent on purifying humanism of the religious taint. They partly adopt that posture because that's what they really believe about humanism and secularism, but they're also in some ways compelled. They feel compelled to adopt that posture because the religious right is running with the notion that humanism is a religion, and making all kinds of legal headaches over that with that claim.
It's a fascinating arc to the story. It's fascinating that that's where it ends, when it began with pretty much the opposite position, which is that we need to make humanism a religion, and it ends up being the complete opposite by the end.
That's right. Now, I would say there's certainly humanists who continue to resist that purifying gesture. But I do think, even the American Humanist Association, which used to have a strong kind of Unitarian religious humanist dimension to it, I think, would try to clarify how humanism is not a religion. Certainly the Center of Inquiry and Skeptical Inquirer, and those groups would, Council on Secular Humanism, all of that would, really insist on a really clear distinction. Where would you see a kind of more religious humanism again? Probably in some of the ethical culture societies out there still, or the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard, where there's still some sense of that religious humanism. So frankly, religion did become much more of a bad word across the board for humanists after the 1980s and 1990s because of the religious right. So you see less of it. You do just see less of it.
It's a very rich story with a lot to tease out of it, and we're just scratching the surface on it.
I appreciate that.
The book has a lot more and is a lot more in depth, and I think we're barely getting into any of the stories of it. We need to move on to Can a True. We have a short game. It's sort of a lightning round. Nathan will tell you more about it.
Yeah. We have it's called a lightning round called Can a True Atheist Do Such and Such? So I don't know Leigh, if you identify as an atheist or if you just want to speak as a scholar of atheism. Anyway, we'll get...
Yeah, you could speak on what a true Painite would do, perhaps. That might be the best way to think about it.
Right. That might be good. Sure.
Yeah, we'll do it that way. Can a true Painite...
I tend to bracket my own metaphysical views for purposes of I've been known to study various religious groups and figures, and so I try not to overtly identify with one or the other.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I suppose one could probably read between the lines on some of the acknowledgments or something over the years. But anyway.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll go with Can a True Painite do such and
Okay.
such, and that will we'll see how that goes.
We'll see how
Okay.
that goes. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Okay. Can a true Painite believe in God?
Yes.
Really? So yeah, you can elaborate on these. They don't
Yeah,
need
if
to
you, yeah, if
just
you
Oh, I
want
get
to.
to elaborate? It doesn't have
Yeah.
one word else? I would say a true Painite in the sense that, Paine was a deist, believed in that kind of God of as a in a mathematical, natural, philosophical way. So it would be hard to say that a true Painite would need to be an atheist. I would think that a true Painite could be a deist.
Hmm. Can a true Painite wear religious symbols?
A true Painite wear religious symbols. Well, that's again not Christian symbols.
Mm.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
So
Good save. I see how you're thinking there.
I
All
mean, but
right. What do
there's
we mean by religion? Back to
I can
first
imagine
terms.
a true Painite, I don't know, having some Masonic connection or something, and maybe having some religious symbol. But I, and I guess if some of those things, those sayings that they attributed to Paine had a kind of talismanic power, I suppose if they created a badge with that said "The world is my country, to do good, my religion," they could wear that.
Mhm, mhm. Can a true Painite be spiritual?
Yeah, that's another hard one. That's true pain not be spiritual. Yeah, that's one a lot of these they fight over. I mean, you can see it in humanistic circles where they will define the spiritual in humanistic terms and they would say yes. So if you were a Painite of that persuasion, like a Unitarian humanist would say, I think yes, that you could be an admirer of Paine, a devotee of Paine, and believe in the spiritual life. They would, but it would be in these very carefully circumscribed humanistic ways.
Hmm. Let's see. Can a true Painite work for ICE or the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency?
You guys, this is boy, this is a challenge. I gosh, can they work true work for ICE? Wow. I'd have to know the role they had at ICE, I think, and
All right. Okay.
what they were charged to
All right.
do.
Right.
That would be a hard one.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would your answer to be? Can an atheist work for ICE?
The problem with atheism is all of them are possible. Can
Yeah,
atheists believe in God?
that's
Sure. I know a lady. She's an
yeah,
atheist.
exactly. I mean,
She
that's the
tells me she
thing,
talks to
right?
God
Right,
all the time.
exactly.
That's how she knows. Yeah.
It's within the realm of the possible, sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it's like, is there some sort of like internal contradiction there or
Diction,
something like
right?
that? Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
go ahead.
Uh, um, okay. Can a true Painite marry someone who is Christian?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, sure.
Right. Right.
Let's
Okay.
see. I would think a true Painite would be uncomfortable marrying a Christian. I mean that they would prefer to have a secular ceremony and believe that it's important to be equally to be on the same page
Mm,
on that. Yeah.
okay. Can a true Painite pollute the environment?
um, well, ideally, no, but I think again, you
Right.
could certainly
Yeah.
find Painites who were
Uh-huh.
probably polluters. Sure. I
Right.
mean that.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess probably anyone in the 18th century or 19th century weren't thinking too much about pollution. Probably. I don't know. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, again, we could run the membership of the Manhattan, the Manhattan Liberal League through kind of like what whether their stance on conservation or preservation or
Mm,
something,
mhm,
but
mhm, mhm.
it would be, I'm not sure how much we would turn up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Can a true Painite believe in an afterlife?
E- Oh, yeah, they debated that one a lot. They argued over that a lot because the spiritualists were always trying to, work alliances with them. So if you were a Painite who also thought you were a spiritualist, yes, then you would. But there were a lot of Painites that wanted to purify themselves of that spiritualist association and thought the only thing a true Painite could do, the only kind of little hedge they could do toward that would be to adopt an agnostic posture. But that so they worried about these spiritualists kind of joining in their group. Some were kind of tolerant of the spiritualists joining in, and others were just outraged that the spiritualists were joining.
Mm. And finally, can a true Painite start a church?
Well, yes. That, I mean, a true Painite, they did. I mean,
Right.
they did.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
They went to them,
Yeah.
but there again, there were a lot of their co believers or co non believers who would have thought that was a very bad idea. That if you don't start a church, you start a club. You don't start a religious fellowship, you start a debating society. I mean, they just didn't. They hated that nomenclature, but enough of the people thought there was just too valuable to leave just to the Christians. So they decided they wanted to have a church.
Yeah. Well, this was fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm in now. I think I'm a Painite.
Painite. I'm glad to know that.
Yeah.
See, I
So,
want to convert without even trying.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Lee. It was a lot of fun. Maybe just I don't know if you want to plug your book one more time.
Well, I think there's some good stories in the book about these figures and, colorful, unpredictable dimensions to the story. So I think it's, a good read in that way. And then it raises some interesting theoretical questions about like what constitutes secular religion. Can secularism be a religion? Under what circumstances would humanists want it to be a religion? And what circumstances do their opponents want it to be a religion? There's just a lot of back and forth, in theoretical terms about that I think is intellectually engaging. So if those kind of questions interest you, then I think you'll find something in the book to interest you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lee.
Oh, thank you.
All right. That was Leigh Schmidt. That was really fun chatting with him about his book. Todd, what did you take away from that conversation?
Well, one is the conversation doesn't have nearly the depth of the book. Book goes really deep.
Mm-hmm.
Even the history that I don't think we laid it out so much here, but I think that there's kind of a break in what we see in this history of secularism in the U.S. because it starts out with this very, very religious idea, right? First with Paine, where people kind of see we've got this idea, or we see the free thinkers are expressing this idea that we need religion, we need ritual, we need this specific form of community to hold us together, create an ethical society, and transcend division. Right? That's that's that first part. But then, as we go through that history, that argument gets turned on its head, and I think that that's one of the big that to me is the big story in secularism in the US. That sure, it begins with this like co-optation, with this mimicry, with what we think of as appropriation in copying this idea of religion. But what it ends up with is a dismissal of all the things that make religion, and a secularization of all the things that are important for society. How we define our rules, where our morality comes from, our ethos, the rituals, what is, for lack of a better word, what's sacred and what's profane. All of that gets completely divorced from this religious project. And the religion part is what we have to do away with because religion is divisive.
Mm-hmm.
You seem
Yeah.
you seem less than convinced by that, Nathan.
I mean, I guess I feel like, I mean, it's true that there is this kind of religious language and like saying that, we need a religion of humanity or whatever, church of humanity and so on. But I think it's also important to remember that there were people in the 19th century who were saying like, no, we shouldn't do that. Like, we don't want any association whatsoever with religion, even though like what they were talking about by a religion of humanity or something like is very far away from Christianity or whatever. I think there were still people who were like, we don't want any, even like a hint of religion, like anything that, yeah, gives an impression of religion, like a church or caring about like Thomas Paine's bones or whatever. So I do think, I mean, like it is an interesting thing, like how that does, I mean, like that does shift anyway. It seems in the 20th century where like, I guess partly maybe because of like Supreme Court rulings and because of culture war stuff that like humanist groups and stuff don't really want to, again, like reject the idea of, for the most part, that they're a religion.
And it's also because I think there's a lot of trial and error here. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
Leigh writes a lot about the churches that are attempted and how they don't really amount to much. They never grow,
yeah,
they never develop.
yeah. And I feel like it's interesting because, I mean, I feel like when we talked to Jackie Frost several episodes ago about the Sunday Assembly and their kind of struggles, I guess, to survive past an initial period of like enthusiasm, when it first starts and people are interested, like how to kind of build something more lasting. I mean, I feel like this has been, it's not something totally new, like what they're trying to do. I mean, this has been attempted for, throughout the 19th century to build these kind of churches, like atheist kind of freethought churches or whatever. And it's the same kind of problems of how do you build something that's lasting. Like even if you have like a charismatic founder or something, like how do you actually create an institution that's going to last beyond the life of this charismatic founder or whatever. And I think it's an interesting thing because for the most part there haven't really been that many successes. I mean, he talked about the Ethical Culture Society, which is still around. I mean, and I mean, the other interesting thing is like, I guess you can sort of come at it from two ways. Like, you build a new institution like the Ethical Culture Society, or you secularize an existing institution like the Unitarians,
Yeah, yes.
which is almost like, basically I don't know too much about the Unitarians, but I mean, like they're pretty secular, I think, now.
I think they're very broadly religious.
Okay, right.
This
Yeah.
is yeah. There's a lot of debates from our perspective, but I don't think there's much actual information. My understanding
Okay.
is that their approach is like all religions are true, or they're all based on a similar idea, and they are religious. Lee
Mm-hmm.
writes about
Mm-hmm.
them and talks about them as a like a humanist religion
Yeah.
and as in
Yeah.
theistic.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, but I think they're very like this worldly, I guess. Like they're not, yeah. But I mean, like you could imagine that in particular congregations of Unitarians, maybe you would get more and more like secular, maybe congregations such that it's almost, or whatever, filled with atheists. I mean,
But
um
your point being that like you can either build one or hijack one, and that
yeah,
when that
right, exactly, exactly,
it
yes.
could kind of
And
change. You can see it changing.
yeah, in the 19th century, like this positivist movement, which we talked a little bit about in the episode, which was started by Auguste Comte in France. But anyway, it had followers all over the world. But in Britain, the followers of the positivists thought, like, or at least one of them, like, thought that it could they could almost like hijack like the Church of England and eventually do the same, like sort of turn that into kind of a religion of humanity. But obviously that didn't work. It didn't happen. But it would be interesting. I mean, like if Christianity or whatever became so secularized that it was just sort of like a place for community and rich and like sort of secular rituals or something. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that would ever happen, but I mean, I think that's like Yeah, those are the two paths, I guess, of yeah.
Well, if you talk to some old school Catholics, they'll tell you that that's what's already happened post Vatican
Right.
II. But
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and to Leigh's point, speaking about Comte, that like he was basically trying to recreate the Catholic Church, and this is what I mean
Yeah.
by that distinction. Like Comte set out to recreate the Catholic Church, but
Mm-hmm.
in different, but getting rid of the religious stuff with
Yeah.
like
Or the
basically kind of like the Jeffersonian Bible, where it's like, okay, we'll just
right.
get rid of the
Right. Yes.
miracles and we'll keep the message
Yeah.
the same and
Mm-hmm.
the history of it. Whereas
Yeah.
even what Jackie Frost was speaking about is something different, right? It's a rejection of even religious organization doesn't exist the same way, right? They're not. It's not top down. You have this. You're trying to build a horizontal structure.
Yeah.
So there is. I see a much broader rejection of it. I mean, and it does. It also speaks to. I think what we're talking about now has this sort of almost pragmatic approach. Pragmatic in the sense like it's not ideologically driven, right? It's we have this long history of deists, free thinkers, non-believers going out and trying different things, trying to do it in different ways, and mostly failing, and those are dead ends, and occasionally succeeding, and those are branching paths. And that
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
time, that's brought us to where we are now. So we have a great history to reflect on what didn't work and what we've
Yeah.
moved past and to see where it's going forward. And
Yeah.
like Leigh's work informs us, right? He's really good at laying out that path, or one of the many paths that can be traced back.
Yeah, and I feel like it's, I mean, not that he's written like a how-to manual of how to like create like lasting institutions or whatever, but I mean, but I do think recognizing that these have been tried like many times can maybe help one like not try and like just reinvent the wheel every time, like every,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
that yeah, I mean, that these things have been tried with some success and some failure and so on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something you can learn from.
Yeah.
Much like I mean the experience, and then there's Paine as well. Are you much of a student of Paine? Student of Paine, by the way, that sounds great.
Yeah. I don't know a ton about him really. Um, yeah, but I mean, from what I know, I like, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He's a weird one because he was basically thrown down the memory hole pretty early on in
Hmm.
America to the
Hmm.
point where like even like yeah, people who are interested in him don't necessarily know a lot.
Hmm.
But he was a
Hmm.
founding father and kicked out of America. I didn't know that he went to France. Do you know how long he was there?
I think just for a couple of years, like he was involved in he was a supporter of the French Revolution, and he was a supporter. And that, anyway, like the French revolutionaries liked him so much that they elected him a deputy to their one of the sort of assemblies. I'm not sure what the name was at the time, but then he in the more radical phase of the revolution, then he was in prison and was going to be he was going to be like slated to be executed, but there was some like miscommunication, or I don't know if it was intentional, but like anyway, like he wasn't summoned to be executed that day, and eventually he survived through like the radical phase, and then like sort of the when things calmed down a bit, I think he left, and I guess he settled in the U.S. But I mean, obviously, like he was in Britain too, and he was also like a persona non grata, I guess, in Britain as well, like
Everywhere.
for his radicalism. So, I
Yep.
mean, especially like, for supporting the American Revolution, like
Yeah, right.
opposing monarchy and stuff. I mean,
And then they lost his bones. How do you like
yeah,
that?
right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, the sort of the afterlife of pain. I mean, like, I mean, literally almost like with the bones and stuff, like, and, sort of fights over his memory and so on.
Yeah. And that I
Yeah.
mean, and it's and that it takes such a religion versus secular society shape in his sort of material afterlife.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a crazy thing. And it shows you how successful these like programs to, get rid of the unwanted historically. Canceling someone even
Yes.
300
Yeah.
years ago, 250 years ago now,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
how well that works.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's astounding. Yeah, I got to make a day trip out to his estate. Go see that.
Mm,
Pillars.
hmm. In New York.
Yeah, I didn't even
where
know it was there.
some,
This is another thing. I don't know it's there. Yeah,
yeah,
it's not far.
yeah. Hmm.
Anyway,
Hmm.
it's amazing
Yeah.
stuff. Anything else? Any other takeaways? This has been a lot. This has been a rich vein for us. It's nice.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I don't think, I mean, there's probably many other things to say, but we should probably wrap it
Oh
up.
my! It's
Yeah.
countless.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah.
check out the book, you'll go
Definitely.
down a
Yeah.
rabbit hole on the you'll find something amazing, and it'll just draw you further and further in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, just like how stuff connects, across decades and across centuries. I mean, like, the legacy of Thomas Paine is still important for today.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
mean, it's still kind of like a active subject of debate about like, what is his legacy and so on. So,
And who is he an
s-
icon for? It's
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so definitely check out Leigh's book, The Church of St. Thomas Paine, A Religious History of American Secularism. And we'll include the links and everything
links
down below.
below. Click.
Yep.
We don't make money
Mhm.
from that, so but Lee will.
No,
That's
no.
the important
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
He
Well, yeah.
wrote it.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Eventually
Um,
a little bit.
I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. um, anyway, so I guess we just need to encourage people to support us on Patreon, and you can access bonus content, including with some extra questions with Leigh.
Yeah, we got those
And we,
every week now. Awesome.
mhm. And so yeah, we want to thank in particular, our patrons, Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus
Plus.
blog.
Yes.
Yes,
Love
yeah.
those
So thank.
guys. Big
Mhm.
ups. And of course, thanks to everyone listening. And if you can't contribute to the Patreon, the easiest way to help us out is click the bell, ring the bell, pull that string, like and subscribe, and pay it forward. Tell all your friends.